everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So, I really didn't expect to be making another episode so soon, but uh, literally right on cue, the day after my video yesterday, where I systematically debunked the smear campaign initiated following um, the Let Women Speak event in Melbourne, Australia. Today I got called a fascist. And I've had tangles with his fellow who did that, Anthony Zinkas, before. Um, Basically, he fancies himself a women's rights advocate, as well as all around leftist. And he's a social worker um, who's worked with rape victims and at rape crisis centers. But he's 100% on board with the whole gender ideology agenda. Trans women are women. Women who don't want men in bathrooms, locker rooms, or even rape crisis centers, strangely enough, are bigots, according to Anthony. That's the world, according to self-described Professor Zinkas, who teaches a few classes at universities in the New York area. And I don't usually single people out personally, but I mean, calling me a fascist, yeah, you deserve it, Anthony. So, as I said to him, your allegation doesn't even make any sense. So let's take a look at the tweet I'm referring to in the context. Let's see, let me switch over my video here and put on my glasses so I can see better. So he says, "Wow, you're a fascist. Who knew?" And let me just relate the whole conversation here. So he says, "You're a cultist if you think that criminals exist only in the party you don't like." And I responded, "And yet you believe men can become women just like the Democrats do." In other words, I'm pointing out that he's part of this cult that basically the entire Democratic Party is part of, that believes that, so to speak, trans women are women, that you're a bigot if you think that males shouldn't be allowed to play women's sports, regardless of whether they identify as women or not, and so forth. So his response to that was, "I believe the gender binary has been historically limiting and that gender is not sex assignment. I also recognize that trans and non-binary people have been a part of humanity throughout our evolution." Whatever that means, I'm not sure. Certainly people have been quite diverse in their personalities throughout our evolution. I really have no idea, and neither does he, whether anybody in prehistoric times literally believed that they were the opposite sex or wished they had been born as the opposite sex. I'm not sure how you would establish that. And so he concludes, "I also believe you and others had no problem with this until you were told to." And this is his typical snotty way of talking to people. Very condescending prick, if I must say so myself. So I responded that not conforming to gender stereotypes is perfectly okay and doesn't mean someone was, quote, born in the wrong body and needs to take cross-sex hormones, get mastectomies or implants, or otherwise alter their appearance in a vain attempt to correct it, quote unquote, is precisely the point that somehow is escaping you. So, he's accusing me of having sort of narrow stereotyped ideas about what men should be like and what women should be like. And I'm pointing out, no, that's exactly what gender ideology does. It says basically, um, if you are uncomfortable with some semblance of conformity to the gender roles that you know or interests, let's say, that males and females in our society typically have. So, if, for example, you're a girl who's a tomboy, or you're a boy who likes to play with girly things, hang out with girls, etc., then you know, transgender ideology says, well, maybe you really are a boy if you're a girl who's a tomboy, or maybe you really are a girl if you are, according to gender stereotypes, an effeminate boy. So maybe you need to alter your body to bring it in line with your quote-unquote gender. And this idea that you were born in the wrong body, that somehow, even though you have a male body, your soul is a girl's, or vice versa. And I'm just saying, it's quite all right for people to not conform to gender stereotypes, and most people don't strictly conform to any sort of gender stereotype. And it's as far as we know always been that way. When I was growing up, my sister was kind of a tomboy. She played football with the boys and so forth. She never had any doubts that she was a girl, and still like to do some girly things like wear pretty dresses and all that kind of stuff. And we all have interests, or what have you, that are not consistent with what society might, or at least some elements of society might say are how our sex is supposed to be. So you don't need to alter your body to conform to your gender non-conforming personality, is all I'm saying here. And quite often people who don't fit in with people of their like kids of their own sex often grow up to be gay or lesbian, and quite a few of them are autistic too. That doesn't mean they were born in the wrong body. Okay, so his response to this basic basic psychology of gender roles really is, wow, you're a fascist. Who knew? Which, my response was, you don't even make sense, because, like, what the hell does that mean? How is saying it's okay to not conform to gender stereotypes, and you don't need to, take puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, do major surgery, in order to address that? You're probably better off. No guarantees, of course, but your best bet is probably to get therapy that addresses any underlying conditions that might be there. Maybe you're simply gay or lesbian. Maybe you're autistic. Maybe you're depressed. Maybe all kinds of things could be going on that would lead you to be, as they call it in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychological Disorders, gender dysphoric. You have gender dysphoria. So, is taking drugs or getting surgery is an appropriate way to address that problem? Well, I don't want to get into a lot of detail on the medical side of this, but I do want to say first of all that going on puberty blockers for an extended period of time, or getting put on testosterone if you're a girl, or estrogen if you're a boy, getting a double mastectomy if you're a girl, so-called bottom surgery. Arguably, these sorts of medical procedures are even worse in terms of their adverse impact on the body than the female genital mutilation that occurs in many Muslim countries and communities that I'm sure a woke person like Anthony would oppose. But saying that it's not necessarily helpful in this context, that makes me a fascist. Come on. So as far as just going into a little bit of detail about the medical issues, first of all, the United States is increasingly behind other countries in terms of where they are with so-called gender-affirming care. 7 European countries so far are restricting so-called gender-affirming care for minors because they've studied the effects and decided that it's harmful. Let's see. Was Norway among those? Okay, the UK, France, Sweden, the Netherlands, Finland, Poland, Hungary, and now Norway has joined them in banning so-called gender-affirming care. And why did they do this? Well, again, I don't want to go into a whole lot of depth, but first of all, the treatments don't necessarily work, or often don't work in alleviating gender dysphoria. So puberty blockers do not alleviate negative thoughts in children with gender dysphoria. Fine study published in the BMJ, I forget what that stands for, British Medical Journal, I think. And somebody I know on Twitter who I discussed the other day because she was one of the women smeared as an alleged Nazi for, and she, a radical feminist and a leftist. So it's a bizarre accusation for being the lead organizer of the Let Women Speak women's rights event in Melbourne, Australia, a couple of months ago. So she has several kids, and her daughter, who was 7 at the time in 2007, had precocious puberty, and a fairly common but by no means universal practice with kids who go through puberty at a very early age is to give them puberty blockers to delay their puberty a bit. But endocrinologists at Royal Children's Hospital of Melbourne, one of the top hospitals in that area, told her that it was too dangerous. Too many adverse side effects were possible to give puberty blockers to kids such as her daughter. And yet, this very same hospital now routinely gives kids high doses of these medications for an extended period of time, much longer than you would do for just delaying puberty for a bit. The American Journal of Psychiatry issued a correction to a recent study where they did a reanalysis of the data that demonstrated that neither gender-affirming hormone treatment, that is cross-sex hormones nor gender-affirming surgery reduce the need of transgender identifying people for mental health services. Okay, this is a web page that summarizes the peer-reviewed literature on so-called gender-affirming care, that is puberty blockers, hormones, and surgery. So typically, gender-affirming care, or the medical part of it, I should say, because they do psychotherapy. Although these days, typically in the United States, therapy is required to quote unquote affirm the child's gender. That is, if, for example, they're a girl who thinks they're a boy or thinks they should be a boy, then this happens at very young ages, where that people, kids don't necessarily have a firm gender identity. But it's like, okay, you are a boy, or you should be a boy. So gender-affirming care is promoted as supposedly a life-saving treatment. It involves social and medical transition. The patient dressing as the opposite sex, which, like most girls may wear dresses, but often they just wear, clothing that isn't all that different necessarily from boys. But in any case, dressing as the opposite sex while taking puberty blockers and or cross-sex hormones to alter their physical features. Studies have shown that 43 to 75% of adolescents with gender dysphoria have at least one type of psychiatric comorbidity. A comorbidity is a condition that co-occurs with something you're diagnosed with. Gender-affirming care ignores many of these contributing factors to gender dysphoria, such as anxiety disorders, depression or other mood disorders, eating disorders like anorexia, autism spectrum disorders, dissociative identity disorders such as believing that you have several personalities, substance abuse, childhood trauma such as being sexually abused or suffering physical violence or seeing your mom get beat up by your dad or something like that. Comprehensive studies show that affirmative care is not safe and effective despite being seen by proponents as a cure for gender dysphoria. Many homosexual or gender non-conforming teens may confuse their anxiety disorders, eating disorders, or other disorders for gender incongruity and dysphoria. Believing that if you're unhappy with your body in general, maybe that means that your body should have been the opposite sex. The affirmative care model prescribes puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to prepubertal children and teenagers who are distressed about their bodies or who have sex atypical interests. 98% of adolescents on blockers will go on to take cross-sex hormones. Puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones can compromise bone health, prevent maturation in the brain, cause infertility, deteriorate genitalia, for example, cause vaginal atrophy, and also prevent maturation of genitalia, such as never having a penis develop to an adult size, and triples the risk of cardiovascular disease. Puberty blockers like Lupron are the same drugs used in cancer treatment and the chemical castration of sex offenders. In other words, they are used to, at least temporarily sterilize people, but, if you're on them for an extended period of time, that can be permanent. And it's not the case that, having gender dysphoria means you're going to be so suicidal that you take your own life. Um, you know, people with lots of psychological disorders have a greatly elevated risk of suicide. So it doesn't necessarily mean, given all the comorbidity, that if you have gender dysphoria and also have suicidal ideation, that you know, uh, gender dysphoria is the only reason why you had that. But studies have shown anywhere from 61 to 98% of trans-identifying children and adolescents outgrow their gender dysphoria as they get older, and presumably that's especially true if they receive good therapy that truly addresses all of their psychological issues, rather than gender affirming psychological care. Now, what happens if what happens if you go through all this and then you get older and maybe you want to have kids? Well, there's a good chance you'll be sterile. If you have the genital surgery, there's a good chance you won't be able to experience sexual pleasure. Of course, if you're a girl who's had a double mastectomy, you're never going to be able to breastfeed. I think I mentioned also one of the risks of these drugs was getting osteoporosis at a young age. So with all this evidence that so-called gender-affirming care causes substantial physical harm and doesn't necessarily resolve dysphoria, which typically either resolves on its own or could be significantly resolved through psychotherapy that addresses the roots of a person's psychological problems. So all this evidence that it's not a good idea, so opposing it makes you a fascist. Well, I'll tell you what sounds a lot more like fascism, or at least a very authoritarian cult, and that's this gender ideology that Professor Zinkus has bought into lock, stock, and barrel. So, there's this mindless recitation of slogans like trans women are women, immense social pressure toward conformity with all of its tenets, where even just a teeny bit of deviation will get you called names, personally attacked, blocked on social media, doxxed, shouted down if you try to speak heresy in public. So, at these Let Women Speak events that I've talked about in episodes in the past, where women gather to talk about why they oppose males being allowed in previously female-only spaces and sports and so forth, or otherwise denounce gender ideology, then counter-protesters show up and try to shut the event down, make so much noise that the speakers can't be heard, for example. If the cops aren't there, then they can do that even more, or they can even physically assault the women. So I've talked before about Kelly J. Keane and others at the protests that she organized in Australia and New Zealand. Women were assaulted. Riley Gaines was physically assaulted at a recent talk at University of San Francisco, and countless other examples. Disagreeing with the tenets of gender ideology can get you fired from your job. A friend of mine, Ann Minash, was fired from her job that she had had for 20 years, just out of the blue without warning, within a few days of sending an email to staff that abortion bans harm women as a sex. You know, like, why? I mentioned the other day, a Twitter acquaintance from Australia, Angie Jones, who organized the Let Women Speak event in Melbourne, Australia, got death threats as a result of being falsely labeled as a Nazi. And she said just a few days ago, she's still getting them. Still getting death threats, still being constantly harassed, etc. Another thing that about gender ideology that certainly raises questions about whether there's sort of an authoritarian streak with that is that there's this enormous backing from corporations and the media and government institutions in all the countries where this way of thinking about sex and gender is prevalent. The Democratic Party here in the United States marches in lockstep on this issue. Every single congressional Democrat voted against the bill back in April, as I talked about in a previous episode, that would have kept males out of women's and girls' sports. And almost all of them dishonestly characterized it as a, quote, ban on trans people in sports motivated by hatred. Here's Congresswoman Cori Bush saying that. Today, the House is considering a trans and intersex sports ban. It wasn't a ban. It simply said that males couldn't participate in women's sports. Any trans kid was welcome to play in the sport associated with their biological sex, or in the case of trans girls or women, if they want to, they can play with the males. In most sports, that's not illegal. And far from being motivated by hatred or bigotry, the bill simply is motivated by the fact that it's not fair for males to compete against females in competitive sports. Now, of course, you can have co-ed recreational sports, but that's with the women's or girls' consent. That's the key thing here: consent. Nina Turner is adamant that if someone says they're a woman, they're a woman. That's her definition of woman. A woman is anyone who says they're a woman. So, I asked her, so if someone says they're a cat, does that mean they're a cat? That's ludicrous. You can't use the word you're defining in a definition of a word. That's one problem. And the other is, it's just a ludicrous way of thinking about it. What other, concept about who people are? I'm sure there are some, but generally speaking, we would never say that if someone says they're black, that makes them black, right, Nina? Rachel Dolezal said she was a black woman, Was she a black woman just because she said so? You know, I'm sure you wouldn't agree with that. You know, back to Cori Bush. She says, gender-affirming care saves lives. Period. While it's unsurprising that hateful Missouri GOP moved a ban on gender-affirming care, medical care for kids, we will remain steadfast in our support of trans youth in Missouri. Well, you know, as we've already discussed, maybe support of trans youth or youth who have gender dysphoria is maybe a more accurate way of describing it, is to address their gender dysphoria through psychotherapy and address their other psychological issues through doing that, rather than engaging in drastic and very often permanently damaging medical procedures. Drugs and surgeries often run tens of thousands of dollars for treatment of in transgender medicine. Transitioned people often wind up requiring lifetime medical care. That I saw a figure the other day of something like more than $1 million per patient. So this is big business, and so that's why you see this near universal backing for this from corporations and at least some major political parties in various countries, as well as much of the corporate media. See, this isn't a grassroots movement. It's an astroturfed movement, funded by big money because there's big money to be made. God, stupid allergies. So, to conclude, I just want to go back to the point that I made the other day. Calling people with these sorts of names, and let me just show you a list of names that a woman on Twitter says she's been called recently by trans rights activists, so-called trans rights activists, but not by anybody else. Include transphobic, bigot, fascist, homophobe, Nazi, murderer, suicide enabler, white supremacist, pedophile, racist, ageist, ableist, misogynist, internalized misogynist, child abuser, Karen, obsessed pervert, etc., cunt, bitch, or of course, ugly. So a lot of these trans rights activists are extremely sexist. They have vile attitudes toward women. I don't want to say that's everybody, but enough so that this is a huge problem. And if you're a person with a thick skin, then being called these sorts of names when there's no evidence that they're true of you might be water off your back on an individual level. But what if such claims go viral? What if government officials start calling you a Nazi or whatever has happened in Australia? The head of state in the state of Victoria, Dan Andrews, called women that attended to let women speak even in Melbourne Nazis. The leader of the opposition party, John Pasuto, did so. And there were others, and the media was just running with that story. So when when these sorts of claims go viral, they can ruin people's reputations, lead to a wave of personal attacks, death threats, rape threats against women, maybe even violence, which has happened. The Auckland, New Zealand Let Women Speak event had to be canceled because the police didn't protect the women or the attendees at the intended event, and it had to be canceled because it was just a very, very ugly, threatening situation where there were actual physical assaults, and people who attended are just lucky they didn't get hurt worse. To be honest. And the other thing is, and maybe this is intentional by some of those who are driving this. I don't know, but this divides those of us who are activists in the fight for social justice, which there are a lot of other issues we need to be concerned with besides this one. We need to stop environmental catastrophe. We need to address economic inequality. We need to stop all these wars that are constantly going on. And how can we build a movement for that if we're at each other's throats about sex and gender? So I just thoroughly reject this sort of neo-McCarthyist, woke McCarthyist agenda that calls people names if they deviate from the tenets of gender ideology. It has no place in any social justice movement, and it needs to stop. Okay, see you next time.